Next up in my weapon videos is going to be the female trio of Andrea, Laena, and Meranda. These three, their weapons are obtainable through the Archery Contest. They have their own board specific to the three of them, and they're honestly positioned in quite an awkward place because of that, because realistically, in terms of the meta of the game and how desirable they are probably the least desirable option to pick in the Archery Contest. It's very hard to be better than the synergy enablers of Jamie, Layla, and Sonara. Then you also have the healing enablers for Jamie and Lats, Enzo, and Drake you have to compete with as well. Now there's also Marjorie's weapon also. As far as their base commanders go, their awakening ability doesn't really have any synergy in itself, but their weapons actually lean them further into the female synergy. All three of them are female, so they do potentially have a role for each troop type in the female synergy. So I have here my spreadsheet going over all the details of them. They are effectively the exact same commander. This video is probably coming out directly after my video on Lats, Enzo, and Drake, and it's going to be some similar talking points because of that. So all three of them have 74% attack and health for their respective troop type, and 76% defense for their respective troop type, and they all have the same awakening ability. So they buff their troop type's defense when they have more allied troops of their troop type than the troop type of the enemy that counters them. That's slightly wordy, but for infantry, for example, with Andrea, if you have more infantry than their spearmen, you'll gain a defense buff, whereas if you have less infantry than their spearmen, you'll gain an attack buff. Now, as I list here, this is done off a proportion, so the wording there is very specific in the awakening ability. It isn't the total amount of troop numbers. So for example, as I list here, if you have 900,000 infantry and 100k cavalry, and you're running Andrea, that will count as less allied infantry than the enemy has allied spearmen, because 100% of their troops are spearmen, whereas only 90% of your troops are infantry. And on the same note, if you have the exact same proportion of troops by a percentage as your opponent, so as it states here, if you have 500k infantry into 500k spearmen, you will not gain any effect at all. You won't gain a defense or the attack from Andrea's ability there. So it's slightly awkward, particularly with the mono meta of the game, and particularly as they're female as well. You're going to want to be running them with the female synergy, and female effectively requires you to run monotype to be at its peak effectiveness. So there's not really any realistic situation where you should have a lower proportion of your troops than your counter, which really negates the effectiveness of their base awakening ability. Luckily for them, their weapon totally flips their awakening ability and gets rid of that entire proportion part of it, and it will just increase their troop type's attack by 35% as a default value, and then it will gain a female synergy effect where every time the commander uses their active skill, it will randomly increase their attack and defense for their troop type by a percentage which scales up from 5% to 15% from the base weapon to 4-star, and it will have a cap of 15 times. You'll never ever cast their active 15 times, so just forget the cap exists. The average actives from a female commander with a 4-star Layla weapon won't even surpass 8, so it's nigh on impossible to actually reach that cap. And then working out how much stats you're actually going to gain from these percentage increases every time you use the active skill is going to be very mathy, and I have it listed out here. The table on the left is using the active values of Layla without her weapon, and on the right is Layla with her 4-star weapon. So if you're anywhere in between, it will be between these two values. In both of these charts, I account for uptime. So in the example here, on the 30th second, you'll cast your active and you'll gain the 15% stats of however many times the active ends up casting off Layla's percentage. But of course, you're not gaining that 15% the whole fight. So whilst you could list it as 15%, you're only having that 15% from the 30th second to the 40th second. And for that first 30 seconds of the fight, you're not gaining any of the stats from here. So that's how the uptime is accounted into this data. There's actually quite a similar curve as there was with Lats, Enzo, and Drake's defense stacking buff when you actually math it out. So without Layla weapon, it's somewhere between 7 and 8% at every interval from base weapon to 1-star weapon to 2-star weapon to 3-star weapon, and then it jumps 15% as the average stats. It is a random stat between attack and defense, remember, so you can effectively halve these and assume it will just be half of each stat. So somewhere in the region of 27% attack and 27% defense there, going up to about 45% attack and 45% defense. Of course, as you gain stars on Layla's weapon, you'll end up casting more actives, so you'll be able to trigger this more, so the numbers go up a little bit. It isn't that drastic an increase, honestly, when you actually account for the uptime as well. But the intervals between the levels from base weapon up to 3-star is between 9 and 10% instead of 7 and 8%, and then it jumps finally 19% in that 3rd to 4th star. As far as takeaways go from what you're actually getting out of the weapons here, the base weapons are actually better than I thought they'd be when I actually went into this and did the mathing out of it. I think because it swaps away from this really awkward proportion tooltip, which you can effectively never get the attack from in realistic situations, and just gives you that 35% attack by default, is huge for it. But the jump from no weapon to weapon is the most significant jump of all, I'd say. The issue just remains, where do they actually fit in? Because the archery contest is so expensive that if you're getting one of these weapons to 4-star, you could probably just get an F5 commander to 4-star and like a somewhat comparable amount of black diamonds if you're grinding it long term and discounting it properly and whatnot. Plus, if you're actually buying into these weapons, you're effectively not buying into the synergy weapons, or for that note, the healing enablers as well, but particularly the synergy weapons. Like, you see the difference that stars on Layla's weapon will make. I would always rather prioritize the synergy weapons over these weapons in the archery contest. Maybe they'll get added to the store directly at some point in the future and you can chase directly what you want, but you obviously have no idea and can't predict that whatsoever. I'd say the best served use of these is chasing Pearl's Tear for Laena and running it with female cavalry. If you get the weapon to base, it shouldn't be that crazy, and she'll slot in quite well with your mid-spender cavalry lineup there. But realistically, she'll never be that great. Like, if you add these stats to her actual base stats, you sort of just become Enzo with the female gender and without the heal. In terms of just a stat provider, she still has a role. Like, you obviously don't have an endless supply of commanders that give as many stats as something like Enzo. As far as like actual synergy goes, you're not really gaining synergistic effects or damage from this. You're just gaining some stats to put you somewhat on the same level as those 90% commanders. So I wouldn't overly advise thinking about these weapons much or investing into them much. The most common scenario I see them in is like max accounts who just have it for the 5k army size, and maybe they have good base attacks on them, so they run them on like other commanders. But for what I'd assume is 99% of you watching this, these commanders have just been power creeps. Their awakening effects aren't that great. Their effects become female synergy, but to pair with your Layla and Salma, definitely Sunel, Daenerys, Cersei, obviously, but even like Arya with weapon, Annie with weapon, if you can get disarms for them, they would be significantly better, I'd say. As a mid-spender, hybriding in weakness and just running Jamie and a healer would probably take you further than a full female setup without any of the F5s anyway. So it's just the meta of the game, the alternatives available just isn't really in a great spot for these three commanders. But If you want to look into buying them, if you have them already, and you want to know what they would provide or what they do provide, halve these numbers down here, and you're probably getting, according to the Layla values that you have at least, half of these values for defense and half of these values for attack as additional stat buffs to add to their existing passive buffs throughout the fight.